Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to have the chance to introduce our guest speaker, Ms. Carrie James. Ms. James is a research director and a principal investigator at Project Zero at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Her research explores young people's digital, moral, and civic lives. Since arriving at Project Zero in 2003, Carrie has worked with Howard Gardner and colleagues on the Good Project. Since 2007, she has co-directed the Goodplay project, a research and educational initiative focused youth ethics and the new digital media. At present, she is also involved in the Good Participation Project, a study of young people's civic and politician participation in the digital age, and in the Civic Trust Among Young Immigration project. Carrie regularly presents her work and teaches at Project Zero's Summer Institutes for Education. Her publications include Young People Ethics and the New Digital Media. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Carrie James.
Thank you so much. Is the microphone working? Maybe not. Someone's rushing toward me. Someone who looks like they know what they're doing. I think that there will be translation happening. So does everybody have a headset if they need them? And if someone is, this is supposed to be a very interactive session, so I'm going to grab the headset. I don't speak Spanish, unfortunately, but I will grab the headset when someone is making a comment in Spanish, and so that we can really connect with one another. So thanks for the kind introduction. I'm really excited to be here, and I know it's been a long week and a long day, so I really appreciate your presence here, and we'll try to be very interactive and increase the energy if you're feeling low energy at this point. I would love, we don't have time to do a round of introductions, and that is a sad fact, but I would love to know a little bit about who's in the room. So can you raise your hand if you are a classroom teacher? Okay, and can you raise your hand if you play another role in a school, like librarian, educational technologist, administrator, head of school? Okay. Is there anyone here who's not working in a school setting? Okay, can you tell us what you're doing?
Me interesa la educación. Me interesa la educación.
I'm interested in education, of course. I work in something completely different. I work on quality systems. But I had to do some training, and I like that kind of professional training too.
Great.
We work at a private foundation in Costa Rica, Central America, jointly with the Ministry of Public Education. We've worked for 27 years in a program bringing technology to public schools.
Oh, fantastic. So there is a connection with schools, even if you're not in a school itself. Wonderful.
Yes, there is.
Okay, so it's great to hear a little bit about where you're coming from. The next thing I'd love to know is what ages of young people you work with. And it can span, how many of you work with youth between the ages of pre-K all the way up to 12? Span the age range. Okay, a couple of you. How many of you focus just on primary school students or pre-K? Early education. And middle school? Or, okay. And secondary school? Okay, great, very helpful. And how many of you, well, here's a better way to put this question. Was anyone not at the talk I gave earlier today? Okay, a couple of you, and that's fine. But I won't spend a lot of time repeating, and we are going to go do a deep dive into something a bit different from what I talked about today. So that works fine, and I know that they will be posting a video of my session for those of you who weren't able to come, so you can get a better context for the work that I've done. So what I'd like to do in this session, the plan, is to just give you a tiny bit of background as to this issue, this topic that I've been working on, which is digital ethics and how young people think about the moral and ethical dilemmas that often come up because we live in a digital age. So just a little bit of context for that, and then we're going to dive into a privacy dilemma that is related to social media. We're going to look at a dilemma, and I'm going to have you work together in pairs, looking really closely at the thinking of a couple of young people in response to this dilemma. These were young people we interviewed. And then we're going to have a discussion around some of the themes you saw there. I'm going to have some thinking routines to guide your looking, because we are at the International Conference on Thinking, after all. And then we'll do some reflection, and I'll point in a general way to some of the additional resources that my partners and I have developed, and some ways we've been thinking about trying to increase young people's sensitivity to ethical issues related to the digital age. So that's the rough plan, and let's get right into it. So the research I've done is part of something called the Goodplay project that Howard Gardner and I have been principal investigators for. And the big questions we've been looking at is how are young people thinking about these moral and ethical issues when they spend time in new media environments? What kinds of considerations guide the choices they make? Choices to post particular photos on Instagram, to make particular comments in social networks, to make certain moves in games. So how do they make choices online? What are they thinking about when they make decisions? And how do they respond to moral and ethical dilemmas? Are they even aware when they have dilemmas on their hands? And how do they think about them? So the basis for this is we did a lot of in-depth qualitative research, rich interviews with young people between the ages of 10 and 25. We also did interviews with adults, parents and teachers of young people between the ages of 10 and 14 to really understand were there differences in how adults were thinking about some of these themes and these moral and ethical questions. And all of the interviews took place in the northeastern US. So the US context is important to note in our research. And we worked with a couple of educational design partners like Common Sense Media to develop some classroom materials. So that's the work in a nutshell. We've written up the results of the work in a variety of places, but most recently my book Disconnected, which focuses on 3 particular topics that we looked at in depth. How do you think about privacy in a networked era? How do they think about issues like ownership and authorship, given the affordances that digital technologies provide, copying, pasting, downloading? And how do they think about the norms that should guide their conduct in social media spaces? What are their ethics of participation? Those were the 3 big topics covered in the book. But like I said, I'd like to dive deeply into issues around privacy in this conversation today. So one of the methods that we used in talking with young people, certainly we foregrounded their lived experiences on the internet. We really wanted to understand what kinds of spaces were they participating in, who were they interacting with, and how were they thinking about those day-to-day experiences and decision points on the internet. But the other thing we did is we created some hypothetical dilemmas that were realistic or true to a lot of young people's experience, and that really embedded a moral or ethical dimension into the situation so that we could see how they might respond. So this was a really effective way of getting at how young people think about the ethics of privacy, for example. So I'm going to share with you one of the dilemmas, the privacy dilemma, that we presented not to the younger people in our study, not to the 10 to 14-year-olds, but to the teens and young adults. And when you see the dilemma, you'll understand why, that this was a dilemma that we presented just to those older youth in our study. So it's a dilemma of privacy. And actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand out the English version and read it aloud, but I'm going to put the Spanish version on the screen. So how many of you speak English? Okay. Here. Here's a couple to share. Oh, that would be great. If you could go to, and I just need to hang on to one for myself. All right. Okay, so I'm going to read in English, but for those of you who speak Spanish, the Spanish is on the screen. Imagine you're a varsity athlete at your school. Your team has a strict policy that prohibits going to parties during the season. Your friends who are not on the team convince you to go to a party the night before the big game. They tell you that your teammates and coach will never know you were there. The next day, when you log onto Facebook, you see that one of your friends has posted some public photos of the party and tagged you in 10 of these photos. Some of these photos show that alcohol was present at the party. You're concerned that your team captain, who is Facebook friends with you, will see the photos, tell the coach, and bench you for the big game. What do you do? So I just want a parenthetical note, a side note on this dilemma. When we presented this to teens and young adults, many of them said, oh, I was in a situation that was very similar to this. Maybe some of the details had changed a little bit, but this kind of thing was pretty familiar to the young people we interviewed, and as a matter of fact, pretty familiar to a lot of adults I know. If you change some of the details around, oh, I said I was too tired, I couldn't go out that night, but then decided to go out to dinner with some other friends who took a photograph, the friend who was holding the party, or that I decided not to go to, noticed that I happened to feel better and was out on the town. So these kinds of dilemmas don't just come up around rules for athletes in school. They come up in all of our lives. So the question of how we think about them is really interesting and I think important. So what I'd like to do now is have you read closely one quote from a young person who responded to this dilemma. I have brought 3 quotes from 3 different young people, and I've put handouts on tables up here, and I'll invite you up in just a moment to grab some of those handouts. I want you to focus on one of the quotes, but I'm going to give you all 3 so that you can later look at some of the differences. And I'm going to ask actually not everybody to look at the first quote by Violet. Maybe some of you can look at Thomas, and the others can look at Michelle. Those are the 3 young people represented by these quotes. So I'd like you to read very carefully and then engage in the following thinking routines. Step inside. What is this person thinking about and focusing on? What might this person understand or believe? What might they care deeply about? Connect. Can you draw any connections between the situation and your own experiences? Have you ever had an experience that's similar to what this person or what this dilemma suggests? And challenge. Are there any ideas or assumptions you want to challenge or argue with in this young person's way of thinking? And then I'd like you to share your thoughts with a partner. I did bring some Post-it notes that I'll put on the table if you want to write down your thinking on some of those notes in response to any of the steps in the thinking routines. That would be great. But I think the conversation is also an important part of this, a conversation with a partner. So I have handouts in English, the quotes in English here. For folks who speak English, I have quotes and the pair share instructions in Spanish at this table for those of you who speak Spanish. So come on up and grab handouts. And they're in stacks of 3. So those are all 3 quotes. and you can just grab a whole stack. There are 3 different quotes. There. You take all 3. Focus on one, but you'll have the other to read. Oh, English are at that table. Does everyone have what they need? You have English? Okay. Okay. Okay, sure.
James, you asked us to focus on just one case.
Focus on one case. I don't want everyone to focus on Violet. Let's get a little. Focus on one case, go through the thinking routines. If you have time, after you focus on that one quote, read one of the other ones, because they are a bit different, and I think it's instructive to look at the different kinds of thinking going on. Are you amused by their thinking? All right, so I know the time is short, but I would love to have some reflections as a group and hear a bit about what you've been thinking in your conversations. So what stood out to you, first of all, when you stepped inside one of these teens' perspectives? What stood out to you? And I will have headphones here. Here.
I think for us it was a sensation of the invasion of privacy because in a way we have experienced in the past some similar situations, and you feel that something has been taken out of you. For instance, if they take a photo and you don't want to be published, or you don't want anybody to see you in a happy situation or whatever.
Right, right. So that loss, that invasion of privacy that I think that Violet, for those of you who looked at the quote by Violet, she really felt betrayed by her friend. That loss of privacy comes up. Other things that stood out to you when you stepped inside?
We talked about a bit like his image.
Thomas?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Thomas's image of what others might think of him, and a bit about his reputation, but as well as
what other things he didn't take into account. So what things don't matter for him.
Okay.
So we were talking about that he doesn't care whether his team, whether his drinking is bad for his team. Okay. He cares for his reputation.
Okay, so some absences in his thinking, some things that, you wish you had seen, maybe? Is that?
Yeah, some more responsibility maybe I'm taking on his part.
Okay, great. Now, one thing I should say is that these quotes are taken from longer interviews, but the quotes really reveal their dominant way of thinking about this. And sometimes other considerations came up when we asked about them, when we prompted them, but these really reveal the strongest thinking that we saw from each young person. Other different things people noticed.
A ver, yo he visto perfectamente.
I saw my students reflected on these quotes. They would all avoid the problem. They are concerned about the pictures and pictures being published and tagged there, but at the same time, they're publishing photos all the time as well. They would get angry, they know it's a mistake, but they don't really face the problem. They try to avoid it. That's what they do. And we are trying to discuss what we would have liked them to say, but they're not adults, so they're not going to say that. They will continue saying this because this is what they really think. How can we change that?
Those of you who don't speak Spanish, everyone was able to hear the translation, right? Oh, if you don't have headphones, you did not hear. So, so she shared that she heard the voices of her own students in these quotes, that she really, that there's this effort to really avoid the problem, not thinking sometimes about wanting to share a lot about what they're doing in their lives, and not always thinking about the broader or later implications that would come from it. And the other key point she raised is, we can look at these quotes as adults and notice some of the absences and the things that we'd like to see, but they're young people, they're immersed in worlds where their peers and the things that they're doing with other young people matter the most to them. So how can we change that? How can we broaden their thinking? And I think that's a great question and something I want to talk a little bit about. Other things that came up either from stepping inside or connections that you made. Did any of you really feel a connection to the thinking that you saw in the quote you looked at? Yeah.
Most of us did, certainly when we reflected back to being 17, as Michelle was, who we're looking at. I know that I can also relate to it very much just as a 50-year-old adult, and relate that to the small breaking of rules that I've done and I do and will do at times, sometimes because it is in my best interest.
Yeah.
Although I am looking a little more broadly and longer term.
Yeah.
But the other part is there's sometimes where I break rules because I don't think the rule has a good spirit. I don't think there's a good reason behind the rule. So yeah, I could definitely identify with.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people in response to this dilemma have asked, well, did any of the students question whether the rule was fair, the policy about not going to the party? And surprisingly few, only one or two, said, well, the rule isn't fair, and I would, push back on the policy itself. But not that many. Many of them accepted this as a reality, and it resonated with their experiences of the kinds of rules that they're subjected to at school and in other environments. So they felt a connection and didn't do that impulse to question. But I think that is an important thing to think about. Other connections or challenges? Other points people wanted to raise that came up in your conversations or in your own thinking, right here.
In Spanish.
In my experience as a teacher of students between 10 and 11 years old, I see that this happens all the time. They use Instagram, right? Not Facebook so much. They all use WhatsApp. I think the issue here is their emotional maturity. I can explain to them the risk of taking a picture of a classmate and to put this on Instagram or share it through WhatsApp, considering they are minors and there are some legal issues by signing up on a social network, even if they're under 18. And this leads me to think that they are not emotionally mature and they're not truly aware or conscious of that risk. As an adult, I know what's right and what's wrong, and they don't. So it's like a dual problem. So it's a lack of social of emotional, maturity, but at the same time, some legal aspects are involved as well. And to make it worse, in a way, parents also are part of this big party, right? Because they are the ones who give a smartphone to their kids and who are not really paying attention to what their children do with it. I don't think it's normal that an 11-year-old girl has 100 WhatsApp messages at 11 p.m., you know?
For those of you who don't speak English, there were a lot of great points here around the emotional maturity, especially of 10 and 11-year-olds, who this gentleman works most closely with, and their inability to think forward and to think about the impact of some of the things that they're sharing in these spaces, and really reiterating the need for adults to be very much aware of the kinds of things that youth are thinking about and deciding to post online that also raise legal issues, that they're involved in social networks and they're not legally of age to be a part of them. And so those issues also need to be brought to bear. And I think that what's raised here is a little bit, it creates dilemmas for us as adults as well. I mean, we face dilemmas around to what extent we should be monitoring young people's social media accounts, to what extent they deserve some privacy, especially as they're developing their sense of identity and their sense of who they are, and at what age that should happen. Maybe at a 10 or 11, we should be much more involved, but when you're talking about a 16 or 17-year-old, to what extent should we be in the business of looking at their Facebook accounts, having their passwords, versus just being there for lots of conversations and asking good questions about what's happening. So I think it does, there are points of tension around these issues. So in the interest of time, I would love to talk more, but I want to move us forward a little bit and share a bit about some of the thinking that I've had related to how youth respond to these dilemmas. So we have a couple of, I think, excerpts from these quotes, and I think these particular pieces show different ways of thinking that I want to highlight. So I think Violet up here is really focused on getting herself to be able to play the game. That's the most important thing. Untag it. Take those pictures down. That's unfair to me. I want to play the game. So she's really, her response is deeply self-focused and really concerned with the consequences for herself. Michelle has part of that too, but what I'm highlighting here in this excerpt is Michelle's reflection on, I do want those photos untagged, but I'm also letting the team down. So she's doing some moral thinking about how her choices and decisions might affect the other people, the other stakeholders in this situation, and those are the fellow athletes on the team. I'm letting them down, I might get benched, and I can't be there for the big game, and they might feel like, we need your help, you're a good player. So that really highlights a broader kind of thinking. And then this third quote by Thomas, even though we also see Thomas talking about consequences, doing a bit of moral thinking, I really appreciate this last part of Thomas's quote, where he says, I would apologize for being irresponsible, and also, if I'm an upperclassman or an older student at the college, say how I'm not setting a good example. And I think Thomas there he's going beyond the people he knows and thinking about, how is my behavior on this public social network really modeling for other students on campus who I don't know and other people on the internet what's appropriate. So that really gets at those three pieces, to my mind, really get at these distinct ways of thinking, which I talked about in my talk earlier today, but for those of you who weren't there, the inner ring is that real focus on what's going to happen to me as a result of this decision or choice. The kind of thinking we absolutely want young people to do, but we also want to balance it with thinking about people in that moral ring, people we know well, the teammates, close friends, family members, but then we also want to think more broadly about the wider community that may be influenced by the things that we share online, because the reality is we're in network publics. Even if we use privacy settings, the content we share with our friends can be copied and pasted and shared with a broader audience than intended, and that's a reality that young people have to reckon with. And we as adults in their lives have to really prepare them for and really remind them of, in the spirit of some of the comments shared here. So in my book, I talk about absences of thinking, so thinking shortfalls, things that we didn't see as a research team when we looked at some of the narratives of young people about digital life, blind spots. Oftentimes they weren't aware of or really engaging with some of the ethical dilemmas inherent in sharing photos on Instagram, in downloading illegal content. How does it affect musicians who are creating this content? Those considerations were absent in many cases. So those were utter blind spots, failures to be sensitive to moral or ethical dilemmas. But we also saw what I call disconnects. That's where youth we were talking to would recognize that a particular action might have a negative effect on someone. So yeah, maybe I would be letting my team down, but the most important thing, they would prioritize another way of thinking. The most important thing is I protect myself, or the most important thing is that I get the content that I want. When we were talking with young people about illegal downloading, this came up. You know, some of them said, well, I have friends who are musicians, and they're suffering because their music is being pirated. At the same time, I don't have any money and I really don't care, and I really like this music, so I'm going to take it. So that's an example of a disconnect. So those were some of the thinking absences or shortfalls and gaps that we identified in the research. So what to do about this? So I write in the book about trying to develop approaches to digital life that are much more conscientious or aware of, pushing to that outer ring, pushing to the moral ring, but also most importantly to that ethical thinking ring and thinking more broadly. And I break down some particular skills that I think are important. And I can talk more about those, directly with folks. But I also emphasize that it's not just about skills, especially when we think about older youth. When we think about teens and young adults who have the capacity to think in an abstract way and to do the forward thinking, but they may not be sensitive to opportunities to do that thinking. They may not be inclined or disposed to think about some of those issues. So what can we do to up their sensitivity? What can we do to support them to think more broadly? And that's the real question. So a couple of general avenues that I've thought a lot about are, number one, figuring out, creating time and space to have young people reflect on their sense of responsibility. So what would this look like? So this might quite simply look like taking the time to ask your children or your students, who or what do you feel responsible to when you're on Facebook, when you're posting photos on Instagram, when you're creating this video that you're going to upload to YouTube? Who do you feel responsible to? And what does it mean to be responsible in that context? What does it look like to you? How might you enact that sense of responsibility? I think just asking the question is sensitizing children and teens and young adults to the important issue of responsibility, because many of them feel responsibilities, moral and ethical responsibilities to others, but that sense can fade into the background. So part of our role as adults in their lives is to bring them forward, to remind them of these issues. Another effective tool for this is in Common Sense Media's digital literacy and citizenship curriculum. They use the rings of responsibility, and this was directly created from our research because we partnered with them in the creation of those materials. Using the rings to really remind youth of different spheres of responsibility. Having this set of rings visibly present somewhere in young people's lives, in a classroom or at home. When you go to post, are you thinking about all 3 rings? It's a very simple and I think elegant way to push thinking a bit more broadly. And so you see the parallel here, the self-focused thinking, the moral thinking, and then the ethical thinking that I spoke to earlier. Thinking through dilemmas. I think that, I talked today in my talk about some high-profile cases where people made digital missteps, but I think everyday decisions that youth make, as presented in the privacy dilemma, are even more important to talk about. So there are a variety of simple dilemmas that probably you could surface from your own experiences and observations of young people you know, and certainly you can use some of these simple prompts that I've devised to have young people think about and surface and make visible their own thinking about situations like this that come up, and then really invite them to take different perspectives on a dilemma. So identify all the people who might be involved in a given dilemma. Try to consider the situation from their point of view, and then envision action steps. What might you do? How might your actions affect different people? And what do your actions say about the responsibilities you feel and the responsibilities you prioritize? So I think these are ways of nudging youth to think in that broader way that I believe is really important. There are some specific resources and tools available online that I think can support some of this. Certainly thinking routines, and I've used a bunch. I've kind of mixed and matched thinking routines for engagement with this dilemma, and these are dilemmas that you can use with your students. I'm happy to send anything to you, the quotes from young people and the dilemmas themselves. My colleagues on the Good Project have a tool on the website that allows users to sort different values, which is another way of thinking about the responsibility question. There are sort of interactive cards that you move around, and I think it's a great thing to do from time to time. It's another way of foregrounding for young people the issue of ethics and responsibility. Curriculum, Common Sense Media, I think has some great individual lessons. They have one set of cases related to privacy and trying to scaffold young people to think about respecting other people's privacy, because there is a lot of internet safety material around protecting your own privacy. There's much less on the ethical and moral dimensions of privacy, and I think in that set of lessons, they do a pretty good job of addressing that issue. Time check here. What's that? Sure, this is just...
Name for the lesson?
Yes, it's called The Secret Sharer. So it's a couple of different cases of content being shared, secrets being shared without the knowledge of an individual involved, and some great reflective questions. So that would be another example of thinking through dilemmas. And some writings, in addition to some of the books I've mentioned, my colleague's book, The App Generation, I talked about earlier today, which I think is less on ethics, but on some broader themes. Katie Davis and I wrote an article about tweens, so 10 to 14-year-olds, thinking about privacy and what some of the implications are for educators that might be of interest. And I think these slides are going to be posted on the ICOT site. If not, please email me and I can send them to you so you can have the links and the names of these articles and resources right in your pocket. And so some final reflections. We're at a close right now, but I would love if we could hear from a couple of voices. How did what we did today connect with what you already know or have been thinking about I heard one or two comments in that regard here already, but did any of the ideas shared extend your thinking in new directions? And what challenges or puzzles are you still sitting with? And certainly they're numerous when we think about this digital landscape. So does anyone want to share a thought in response to any of these reflective questions?
I think it's the big challenge is we're facing. I'm sorry. I think the big challenge is we are facing a new way of thinking. I mean, since the communication, the way we communicate change, we are facing a change of era, definitely. Yeah. Rather than an era of changes, we are in a complete new way. And what it might be wrong from the ethical standpoint for us adults, not necessarily means anything for them. Because I think with the internet, what they feel is that all information is free. All the how do you say, cultural assets are free for them to grab. Yeah. And the problem is from then it goes basically why not the material things are also for free for us to grab. I mean, and that's why they don't respect the privacy or, I mean, they say there's nothing wrong. They probably don't think that is a major thing wrong. That is the major challenge we have to face, how to make them aware that we have to live in a world where we respect other people.
Yeah, yeah, I think you're quite right. I think that especially the areas around intellectual property, I think those are particularly contested. And I think there is some change. You know, there are musicians, for example, who want to have all their content made, you know, available for free. So it is a very changing landscape, and our views about adults' views and the law related to some kinds of property inevitably will change as a result of digital technologies, that's for certain. But regardless, I think having young people be in the habit of doing that kind of ethical thinking of, you know, how might this person who created this content feel, and want to make sure, checking to make sure, you know, that what you'd like to do with the content maybe aligns with their intentions and their hopes for how it might be used. But I think just the challenge of keeping up with all of this and the changes that are to come is a formidable one. It's huge for all of us. I know we're over time, but one more thought. Yes.
I'm very much in line with what my colleague said about especially young kids and especially WhatsApp. That's the problem that brought me to this meeting, to this talk. In my case, we had a few girls who had problems within a WhatsApp group, problems that came from the fact that there is some kind of sense of impunity to whatever they say or do in these networks. So they feel they can do anything they like without any consequences, without caring about who's paying attention and what they're going to think and who's going to get hurt. And, you know, because I said it on my cell phone, I'll see you tomorrow, and that's a different context, but it's not, right? And it only came to our attention because of, well, the parents of one of these girls came to the school and said, look what we found on our girl's cell phone, right? The first thing I thought was, why does she have a cell phone? And why don't you pay more attention to what she's doing with it? But that, of course, is also in line with what you say. We have to decide how far we can go into this monitoring and since when. And there's another point that I'd like to make, and that is the new sense of power that WhatsApp groups give to the administrators. And that creates some kind of divide between people who are let in and the people who are left out, and also with the people that are not in line with the administrators' thoughts, rules, or whatever, that can be kicked out of the group anytime. And I don't think kids, especially younger kids, can deal correctly with that kind of power. They deal intuitively, but they do so in a very, very brutal way without having anything else into consideration.
I think important points that you're making, and I think one of the most important that's standing out for me is that we can't afford not to understand how many of these technologies work. Like, what are some of the specific powers that they lend to the users? So WhatsApp and what you can do with that technology. We can't afford to not keep up with the latest thing that young people are using and how they're using it, and hopefully use that as a springboard to really reflective conversations about some of these puzzles and dilemmas that come up, because we can't monitor everything, and it may not be the best way to form really conscientious citizens to watch what young people are doing and catch them. We need them to form a moral and ethical compass of their own, and so giving them some tools for thinking, I think, is a more effective way. I really have a concern around the use of Turnitin, which is that software that is used to check to make sure people aren't plagiarizing. I can see why it's used, but what we heard loud and clear from the young people we interviewed was that they were very concerned about being caught for plagiarism. They were very concerned about citing sources so they wouldn't get caught or fail a paper or a class. They had very little understanding of why you wouldn't want to plagiarize and the importance of paying appropriate respect to a person whose ideas you're using. So I think we do a disservice if we don't give equal weight to the ethical rationale behind citing other people's work. And so it's a balance between those things that we have to strike as adults. So thank you so much for your time this evening. I wish the conversation could go on, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Certainly be in touch with me. You can send me an email, and I'm happy to send you the slides and the quotes and any other materials you might, that might be useful to you. Thank you.